looked up and smirked. I'm not just a dog owner. I own a certified kennel, and the law is on my side. Karen opened her mouth, but I continued. Now, let's talk about where the HOA's money disappeared to. Silence filled the room. But then things got even more interesting. I had lived in this neighborhood for almost 5 years, a typical American suburb, the perfect place to grow old and watch kids chase a ball across neatly trimmed lawns. The houses were painted in pastel colors, white picket fences gleamed in the sun, and neighbors greeted each other without prying into each other's lives. Well, almost without prying. Of course, we had an HOA, a Homeowners Association that was supposed to keep things in order, but until recently, it had existed more in name than in practice. Old Mrs. Davis, a frail elderly woman who was never seen without a glass of lemonade, had been running it for years. She wasn't a dictator, just a sweet old lady who liked sending out friendly reminders about HOA fees. No one complained. But then Karen came. Or rather, she stormed in. After a series of scandals and complaints, including a ridiculous one about someone parking too close to her house, Mrs. Davis decided she'd had enough. Karen immediately declared herself the perfect candidate for HOA president, and since most of the neighbors didn't care, she won the position without resistance. That's when everything changed. The HOA, once a mere formality, became Karen's personal kingdom. She started issuing decrees like a queen on her throne. No cars parked on the street after 10 p.m. Fences must be no higher than 3 feet. All mailboxes must be the same color, and if yours isn't, you get fined. But the worst part? Karen loved controlling her neighbors. She wrote down license plates if cars were parked incorrectly. She measured lawns to ensure the grass wasn't too high. She literally walked around with a notebook, documenting violations that no one but her even noticed. And then she came after me. It all started the day I was walking my St. Bernard Ben like I always did. We were on our way back from the park when suddenly a nearby door flew open and Karen came rushing into the street. "What is that?" Her voice sounded like an alarm. I stopped instinctively. Karen stood before me, hands on her hips, her cheeks flaming like she had just run a marathon fueled by pure hatred. I blinked. What are you talking about?" She pointed a finger at Ben, who sat peacefully beside me, lazily wagging his tail. "That beast!" Karen nearly jumped. "It exceeds the size limit set by the HOA rules." I blinked again. "I'm sorry, what?" As if she had been waiting for this moment, Karen dramatically unfolded a piece of paper printed in some official-looking font. "According to the new HOA regulations, dogs over 40 pounds are prohibited." I stood frozen, trying to process the sheer absurdity of what I was hearing. "But he's a St. Bernard," I finally said. "They weigh over 100 pounds by definition." Karen gave me a smug, self-satisfied look. "Then you'll have to get rid of him." She crossed her arms and straightened up, as if expecting me to snap to attention and say, "Yes, ma'am, I'll immediately get rid of my beloved dog." I was in shock. No, seriously, I knew Karen loved power. I knew she would find a way to create a problem where there was none. But this? Did she honestly think I would just give up Ben because she suddenly decided to make up some ridiculous rule? I looked at Ben. He looked at me. Neither of us could believe this was actually happening in real life. I knew Karen wouldn't give up that easily. She was the kind of person who would blow a problem out of proportion until she got exactly what she wanted. But even I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The next morning, I went out to get the mail and discovered that every single mailbox in our neighborhood now held a printed flyer with huge bold letters. "Dangerous animal in our neighborhood." Beneath the alarmist headline was a text filled with exaggerations and outright lies. "One resident of our community is blatantly violating safety regulations by keeping a giant, aggressive dog that may pose a threat to children and other animals. As responsible citizens, we cannot allow such a risk. If you, too, believe that this situation endangers your safety, support the initiative to have it removed. And of course, at the bottom of the flyer, my apartment number and home address were prominently displayed. I clenched my jaw. Neighbors who had waved and smiled at me just yesterday were now eyeing me with caution. A woman actually crossed the street when she saw Ben. And what did Ben do? He just sat beside me, let out a lazy yawn, and wagged his tail, looking up at me as if to say, "This again?" But Karen wasn't done yet. About 2 hours later, just as I was about to head out for the day, a police car pulled up in front of my house. I clenched my fists. A tall officer stepped out, holding a folder. He took a lazy glance around the yard, then looked at me and Ben, who was still sitting peacefully by the porch, licking his lips after finishing a biscuit. "Good morning, sir." I nodded. "How can I help you?" The officer flipped through a few papers and gave me a neutral look. "We received an anonymous report about a dangerous animal on your property." I took a slow, deep breath to keep from exploding right then and there. "You mean my Saint Bernard?" Yeah." The officer glanced at Ben. I didn't even bother hiding my sarcasm. "Saint Bernards are companion dogs. They were bred to save people in the Alps, not eat them." The officer looked at Ben. In response, Ben let out another yawn and flopped onto his side, wagging his tail. "He seems friendly," the officer admitted. I crossed my arms. "So, what's the problem?" He scratched the back of his head. "Well, according to the complaint, he's scaring the residents." I smiled again, but this time without a shred of friendliness. "The residents? Or just one specific person?" The officer smirked slightly. He had clearly dealt with these concerned citizens before. "I understand, sir. But by procedure, I still have to issue you an official warning." He handed me a paper. I took it and cast a quick glance toward Karen, who stood a short distance away with a smug grin plastered across her face. "People with too much free time are so predictable," I muttered, turning and heading inside before I lost my temper. But as it turned out, that still wasn't the end of it. The next morning, at exactly 9 a.m., there was a sharp knock at my door. I opened it. Karen stood there, beaming as if she had just won $1 million lawsuit. "I've officially filed a petition for your eviction," she announced, crossing her arms. I blinked. "You did what?" "You'll be evicted unless you get rid of the dog," she said, looking at me like she had just sentenced me to death. Something in my head clicked. For a brief moment, I had the overwhelming urge to, well, you get the idea. Deep breath. Exhale. Did she really think she could just kick me out of my own home? I smiled, calmly, slowly. Karen actually took a small step back. "You know, Karen, you just made a huge mistake." Her smug expression wavered, but I had already shut the door in her face. Because now I had other plans. Eviction? I even stopped breathing for a second. Karen stood before me, pressing her lips into a thin line as she nodded. "Yes, if you don't get rid of that dog, you'll have to leave the community." I blinked slowly, as if struggling to process her words. "That's ridiculous." "It's the law." She said it with such a smug smile, as if she had just won a lawsuit against a major corporation. I stared at her in silence. Something inside me was boiling, but I didn't let it show. I didn't yell. I didn't lash out. I didn't even curse. I just smiled. "All right, Karen. You asked for this." She frowned, but said nothing. I turned around and walked away. I had work to do. For the next 2 days, I didn't just sit around. First, I pulled some strings. An old friend from a law firm sent me every possible statute regarding pet ownership and animal rights. Turns out, HOA restrictions do not apply to certified dogs. Second, I dug up some very interesting documents. Karen had been treating the HOA finances like her personal piggy bank. She had been raising fees without justification, funneling money into shady third-party accounts, and signing contracts with contractors that no one had ever actually seen. And the best part? The HOA had no legal right to force an eviction without a valid reason. My dog had nothing to do with it. I gathered all my evidence, prepared my speech, and waited for the perfect moment. The HOA meeting. The room was packed. Some people came out of curiosity. Some were sick of Karen's endless rules. And some? They were just here for the show. Karen sat at the head of the table, stiff as a queen on her throne, confident she was about to put me in my place. I stepped into the center of the room. A folder of documents rested in my hands. I'd like to make a brief statement. Karen gave me a condescending glance. You have 2 minutes. I smirked. 1 will be enough. The tension in the room thickened. I glanced at the neighbors and spoke, calm but firm. Here's the thing. I'm not just the owner of a St. Bernard. A pause. I own a certified dog kennel. Murmurs spread through the room. Karen's frown deepened. Furthermore, I continued, under federal law, service and certified dogs are exempt from local HOA restrictions. Karen's eye twitched, but I wasn't done. I held up another sheet of paper. And here, I have proof that Karen has been illegally raising HOA fees and misusing funds for personal expenses. I turned to the crowd and held up the documents. Karen went pale. The very people who had supported her just moments ago were now staring at her with suspicion. That's a lie! Karen tried to snatch the papers, but I pulled my hand back. Oh, really? Then perhaps an independent audit will clear everything up. Silence. Dead silence. Karen pressed her lips together, but I could see her confidence crumbling before my eyes. Karen opened her mouth, but had no idea what to say. She quickly scanned the room, searching for support. But all she found were questioning, and in some cases downright furious, stares from the neighbors. The first to speak was Mr. Henderson, an elderly man who had lived here longer than anyone else. Is this true? His voice was sharp as a whip. Karen forced a nervous smile. What exactly? This is all lies, you have to understand. But then Mrs. Roberts, usually calm and friendly, cut in. Right now, she was glaring at Karen with fire in her eyes. You spent our money? That one question, spoken with such outrage, was like a key turning in a locked door. The room erupted. I noticed the fees went up, but I had no idea where the money was going. Did you really transfer funds to some private accounts? Where's the financial report? Karen panicked. Well, it's all more complicated than it looks. But the crowd was already fired up. So you really were stealing? All this time we were paying for your little luxuries? Karen took a step back, desperately scrambling for an excuse. I was doing it all for the improvement of the community. But Mr. Henderson just shook his head. You know what's funny? If you hadn't been so petty, no one would have even started digging. But you just had to go after the guy with the dog. A murmur spread through the room. Some nodded, others crossed their arms, and a few simply stared at Karen with pure disgust. She knew she had lost. For the next hour, Karen tried everything. She claimed the accusations were false, said it was all a misunderstanding, even tried to play the victim. But it was too late. When the vote came, the result was clear in an instant. By an overwhelming majority, Karen was removed as HOA president. She tried to protest, but no one was listening. In the end, she just shot up from her seat, grabbed her bag, and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I watched her leave. And what about her complaint about my dog? I asked, barely hiding my smirk. Mrs. Roberts sighed. Dismissed. No one supported it. I nodded. Good day. A week later, I had even more reason to celebrate. The HOA officially repealed the ridiculous weight restrictions on dogs, rules Karen had fought so hard to impose. But I didn't stop there. Inspired by the whole ordeal, I opened a canine socialization center in the neighborhood, a place where owners of large breeds could bring their dogs and show the community that big dogs weren't a threat, but the best friends you could have. Soon, there were more dogs in the streets than ever before. And Karen? She packed her things and moved away. Rumor has it to a neighborhood without an HOA. Ironic, isn't it?